All right, good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Noisy Reality edition on Sunday, August 16th. And we'll be talking about grand strategy in the contemporary Middle East, the concepts and debates. That's the title of a book that was edited by Tori Peterson and other colleagues. And Dr. Mark Katz's article appeared in that, which has to do with Putin's grand strategy. So we've not really dealt in detail with Soviet and Russian contemporary foreign policy in the Middle East. But we're very happy to have Professor Mark Katz here today. Now, he is a emeritus professor of government and politics at George Mason University and has written many publications, including Russia and Arabia's Soviet Foreign Policy Towards the Arabian Peninsula, Reflections on Revolutions, and Leaving Without Losing the War on Terror After Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Now, first of all, Mark, let's talk about the present situation. Uh, we're getting bombarded with the pictures of the Abraham Lincoln being on duty too long and the examples of crew members jumping overboard. And as all of us know, the carrier battle group is a essential tool of American foreign policy that has been used to uh, intimidate, intervene, badger powers ever since the Second World War. And vis-a-vis the issue of the Soviet Union and Russia today, how do you see this question of what we're seeing right now in front of us with this war in Iran? We have a pact that was just announced between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other Pakistan in the Middle East. We have this constant continuance of the situation in Gaza, acceleration of operations by the IDF in the West Bank, including, outright settler expansion, the war in Lebanon, all this complicated intersectional and connected conflicts, and of course the war in Ukraine. What is Russia's policy in this? What's their grand strategy in this situation in your mind? That's a
Well,
big question.
that is a big question, and certainly the point I made in my chapter for this book was that the main difference between Soviet grand strategy in the Middle East and Putin's grand strategy is that the Soviet Union was a revolutionary power, that it allied with revolutionary regimes, revolutionary movements, and even though it did have good relations at times with some governments that were not revolutionary, he was always very happy when they fell and were replaced by revolutionary ones. And so during the Cold War, essentially, the Soviets had a set of allies in the Middle East. The US had a set of allies in the Middle East, and they tended not to be the same. Now there were defections either way. There were some pro-Western governments that fell, replaced by pro-Soviet ones. There were other pro-Soviet governments that switched sides, Sadat in Egypt in particular, and Siad Barre's Somalia. But there were very few who were not on one side or the other. Obviously, the Iranian Revolution was a huge exception. In other words, this is a government that was, anti-Western, but was not pro-Soviet. And this was a real break in the pattern that we saw elsewhere in the Middle East and throughout the Third World with the Iranian Revolution. That was an exception. And then on the other end, there were a couple of governments that did manage to have good relations with both the US and the Soviet Union simultaneously, Kuwait, North Yemen. Okay, so that was the Soviet strategy, essentially supported revolution, supported anti-Western governments. Putin's strategy, by contrast, well, there weren't that many outright anti-Western governments left. There were a few, and of course they shrunk over the years. But Putin's strategy essentially was to have good relations with every major actor in the Middle East including every one of America's partners. And Putin succeeded at that. And not only did he have good relations with the anti-Western regimes, Saddam Hussein didn't last too long. Obviously, the Assad regime is gone. Iran is still there. But Putin has good relations with all of America's traditional partners, whether it's Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt. One can go on, really basically all of them, even Israel. That Russia, Putin's Russia, has good relations with Israel as well. And what's fascinating is that once we saw the war on Ukraine, and I don't think it didn't go the way Putin wanted. He thought it was going to be over with very quickly, but his strategy in the Middle East paid off in the sense that America's partners did not abide by the Biden administration's call to join Western governments in sanctioning Russia and providing aid to Ukraine. Not at all. And that essentially, a lot of Middle Eastern governments have, America's partners have, I guess, the word neutral is not really, I think, appropriate, because a lot of them have profited. In other words, a lot of the trade that Russia did directly with the West has now been rerouted through Turkey, through the United Arab Emirates, through several others. So in that sense, Putin, I think, has been very successful in this way, and I think he's likely to continue to be so.
Now, when you talk about the relationship, for example, with Israel, could you go further into that? Because I know people who were involved in actually working to encourage Jewish migration from the former Soviet Union, or Soviet Union when it was existing, to Israel. Had a girlfriend who did that basically for 10 years. Uh, and I just wanted to know more about your insights into what you gather from his relationship with Israel. Why did they decide to accommodate Israel?
Well, I think it really is a function of Putin, as I don't think that the existing apparatus in Russia, held over from Soviet days, would have been quite so accommodating. But Putin himself uh, has been very interested in this relationship, and there appear to be,
Why do you think so?
well, there's a number of idiosyncratic reasons. One is that in his early life, and it was a pretty tough life. A lot of bullying. He did a lot of bullying, but he also got bullied an awful lot. That he found refuge with a Jewish family in his collective apartment building. There have been Jewish teachers who took him under
Oh,
their
wow.
wing. In other words, he had a fondness for Jewish people that you didn't find in most ordinary Russians, shall we say. Then there have been other factors, and one is, as you mentioned, this great diaspora of Jews from the former Soviet Union to Israel. And it's a remarkable thing, and I've talked to many of them and looked into this. They left Russia or the Soviet Union because they didn't like how they were being treated there. They go to Israel, and guess what? They fall in love with Russia all over again,
Right.
and they become a lobbying group
Hmm.
for good Israeli-Russian relations, and they've also served as the link. In other words, there's a lot of Russian-Israeli business. And I remember once visiting Moscow, there was one gentleman in particular, his name of Satanovsky, who was sort of the self-appointed head of the um, the Israeli lobby in Russia. And it was fascinating. This group, they were pro-Israeli, anti-American. There was that, and it's I think that this is something that's very meaningful for Putin. There's a lot of Russian speakers, a lot of Russian speakers in Israel, and I myself, when I visited there, I mean, especially for the past in any given month, I'm not so sure how recently, but that you have as many Russian tourists as American tourists in Israel. And Israel's a place where if you're Russian, you can go. It's nice and warm, and everyone you need to speak to speaks Russian. There is a bond, and of course, after there were terrorist attacks. I think it was called Beslan, 2004.
Right.
That I remember I was in Moscow just afterwards, and knowledgeable Russians were saying that what this led to was tremendous degree of collaboration between Russian and Israeli security services. It's partly because Israeli politicians, whether it's Ariel Sharon, Natan Sharansky, Benjamin Netanyahu, they went out of their way to cultivate Russia. And certainly Ariel Sharon in particular, basically, when Putin was involved in fighting in Chechnya, and either Westerners were criticizing him or were indifferent, Ariel Sharon came out and was supportive and basically said, we're fighting the same enemy. You call them Chechen terrorists, we call them Palestinian terrorists. They're the same. And Putin basically, responded positively to this. And there's just been a lot of, certainly in the 90s in particular, Russian arms sales in many developing countries were enhanced with Israeli technology. Israel actually became a source of arms transfers to Russia. During the Russian-Georgia War in 2008, even though two of the leading ministers in the Georgian governments were from Israel, basically, and then the Georgian government claimed that the Israelis were behind them. No, the Israelis made it clear that they were not supporting Georgia, and they did not oppose what Russia was doing at all. So there's been so many instances in which Israeli politicians have been helpful to Putin and vice versa. So there's that. There's there's just a closeness, and I think also is that for as much as the Russians and the Soviets previously have claimed to be supportive of the Palestinian cause, supportive of the Arab states confronting Israel, as the formulation used to be, that at bottom, at a real emotional level, that Israelis and Russians have the same very negative view of Muslims. They share this view, and they know it, and that they're not ashamed of this feeling either. So there's a lot that they have in common, and I think will continue to do so. And yeah, there's just there's just all kinds of reasons, basically. Now, will this outlast Putin? I mean, that's a question a lot of Israelis have, but Putin has certainly been the key factor in developing this relationship, because previous Russian Soviet leaders were not so sympathetic toward Israel, but Putin has been, and there you are.
Well, it's interesting. Just as a historical note, your interpretation of what happens in 47, 48, when you have arms shipments coming from Czechoslovakia that help the Haganah and the Palmach in their fighting against the Palestinians. This is before the intervention of the official Arab armies in 48. But I'm just curious your take on the Soviet Union's relationship with the creation of the State of Israel.
Right. Well, if we go back to Stalin's time, I mean, basically, Stalin had a very skeptical attitude toward British and French European decolonization. If it was done peacefully, it was fake as far as he was concerned, that it was the Western imperial powers leaving their lackeys in place. And for the Israelis, who had fought, also a lot of early Zionist settlers, came from Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, and they were leftists. They were inclined towards socialism. They themselves essentially admired the Soviet Union. And essentially, I think Stalin appears to have thought that that, if you look at the Middle East, that whether it's, here you have Israel, the one kind of leftist leaning state, or possibly so, with every other Arab state, whether it was independent or not, actually either a colony or a neo-colony, if you will. That Israel seemed like a pretty good bet. It seemed like it seemed like the clever thing to support. And of course, they quickly found out, certainly by the time Khrushchev came to power, that, well, no, actually, whatever degree of sympathy that Israelis had with the Soviet Union, it wasn't. In other words, that they were much more interested in working with the United States in particular, and that it wasn't going to be the Soviet ally that they may have hoped. So it strikes me that it was partly Stalin's own miscalculation about what an independent Israel would be like.
Now, how do you see, just to give more historical background, because many people watching this are not familiar with or have less of a knowledge of what happened in the 1950s, how do you see the whole relationship between Nasser and the Soviet Union, with the the whole debate about the Aswan Dam, and then the arms shipment that goes to Nasser from the Soviet Union? How do you see that part of that phase of Soviet foreign policy in the 50s?
Well, one thing I want to point out first and foremost, obviously, Nasser overthrew King Farouk, the pro-British monarch. It has to be kept in mind that the Soviet Union had good relations with King Farouk.
Ah, interesting.
This was really something that's, in other words, that
Wow.
basically they were not sympathetic toward the Egyptian Communist Party. That they were, in fact, happy to work with King Farouk because, they obviously he was, the British had a large role, but they thought he was, he was someone who, well, he was interested in working with the Soviets. Okay, he's out. The free officers, Nasser, come in, and I think that Nasser's, I think his early idea was to play off the West and the East, that to get concessions from both, and it seemed to be working. And then basically the Eisenhower administration, in other words, they basically got tired of this, that they weren't they didn't want to have to play this game, and so basically Nasser moved toward the Soviets. But also one has to, Khrushchev's own view. Now there was a long debate ever since the early days of the Soviet Union, going back to the 1919 Second Comintern Congress, when the communists from around the world were trying to figure out what is their best strategy, in this era when we still had European colonial empires. And basically, Lenin's idea was that the developing world was not ready for communism or socialism, but that you had a lot of what they termed, bourgeois, national bourgeois led independence movement. These were basically, capitalists or would-be capitalists, or if you will. But that objectively, as the Soviets were fond of saying, objectively, their success would weaken the Western imperial empires, and therefore it was in the Soviet Union's interest to support them. So they would do so and de-emphasize the communists, basically order the local communists to support these groups as well. Well, at this 1919 session, there was a communist from India. His name was Roy. Last name was Roy. M.N. Roy. I don't even know what his initials stand for. And he stood up, and this is one of the few times that someone openly challenged Lenin. He said, I'm from this part of the world. I know the situation better than you, in that these national bourgeois people whom you hope to support, that in fact they will not do anything that really harms the Western imperial powers. All they want, they'll settle for nominal independence, that they get to be ministers or whatever, and that they will work with the world capitalist system. What we want to do is support the communists. Those are the ones who struggle will bring about true independence, and that these national bourgeoisie forces are not nearly as strong as you think they are anyway. Well, what they did at this Comintern Congress, these were sort of these arguments were made in by alternate resolutions, and so they decided to pass both. Wouldn't it be clever? We'll support the communists, but we'll also support the national bourgeois forces. So whoever comes out on top will be doing okay. What they hadn't realized, and of course they would find out in China very quickly, is that these two groups would fight each other. The Kuomintang versus the Chinese Communist Party. It didn't work out so well. Okay, so later on, Stalin, he himself, he didn't have.
And here, by the way, is M.N. Roy.
Yeah, there you go.
Roy.
Name, very good.
Manabendra Nath Roy.
Right,
Roy.
right. Yeah, fascinating character. Well, when we come to Khrushchev essentially accepted Lenin's argument. In other words, that he basically fell in love with this idea of a nationalist, Arab nationalist in particular movement. In other words, that it wasn't so important that they weren't communists. They were anti-Western. They were the up-and-coming force in the Arab world. Let's support them. And so there was this certainly, people like Yevgeny Primakov. I mean, they had this love affair essentially with Arab nationalism. They saw it as a halfway point leading to Marxism, Leninism, but there was no need to rush it. And that if Arab communist parties who sought to do so, well, this was counterproductive. And in fact, that Khrushchev infamously did not do much to stop Nasser from essentially beating up on the Egyptian Communist Party. And we'd see this repeated in other Arab countries as well, that when it came to a choice between supporting Arab nationalists, especially if they were in power, and Arab communists, under Khrushchev in particular, they always supported the Arab nationalists. And so this was essentially what they did in Egypt, and it certainly paid off. As long as Nasser was in power, it paid off. But it didn't. What happened was that obviously, we saw with the Arab-Israeli wars, especially 73 in particular. The Arabists basically felt that the Soviet Union was not supporting them adequately, was not doing as much for the Arabs as the United States was doing for Israel. And so we saw, Sadat change camps.
Right. Now, during this whole period, of course, we start from you go back to, you reference the Russian Revolution and the aftermath with the second Comintern. The question of the issue of Muslim militancy, fundamentalism. The Soviets have to deal with a insurgency in the Caucasus, the Basmakis, and then the question of Nasser, when he's in power, he's having battles not only with the Egyptian Communist Party, but with the Muslim Brotherhood, which he suppresses. The famous theorist of Salafism is executed by Nasser. And that gets into the question of how the Soviets are viewing the use of Islam, because of course that was a tool by the United States in the Cold War, leading to what we saw in Afghanistan. But explain that part of the equation and how you see Soviet reaction to that issue, and then how it spills over into Putin.
Right. Well, certainly, long before the Soviet-American Cold War, that the early Soviets, found themselves at odds with Muslims, and the Basmachi were actually Central Asia.
Central Asia, excuse me.
Now, it's complicated because, in the early days, in other words, that the early Bolsheviks did get support from one branch of in the Muslim community in Central Asia, in particular, the so-called Jadidists, who very much like the liberation theologists, Catholic liberation theologists of the 70s and 80s. These were people who believed that the tenets of their religion, as truly understood, and Marxism and Leninism were the same, and that basically, in other words, and so essentially you had within Muslim communities, you had groups that did support the Bolsheviks, and this was very important. But of course, there were also religious nationalists who were opposed to these, and the Soviets had to fight, especially in the 1930s, a pretty serious insurgency against the Basmachi, bandits, that's their term for them. And I think they understood pretty early on that that religious fundamentalists had a very different view of the Soviets. In other words, that they, however anti-Western they were well, obviously, communism was not something that they approved of, and that they tended to have, a view that Russia was just another European colonial power, and we've seen this, elsewhere. Obviously, that we saw this in the Arab world. They were basically put down. We see this tendency in the Iranian Revolution. In other words, that Iran's history of losing territory to the Russian Empire. That I think in the Arab world, I think that there was a romanticization of the Soviet Union based on there was this, what the Soviets argued was that, unlike the West European colonial empires, we never had a colony. Now, of course, it depends on what you count as a colony. In other words, that yes, the European empires were overseas empires, and the Russian Empire was an overland empire, and they moved into places that were, that Muslims lived in, whether it was in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, in parts of what is now Russia itself, and basically, sort of, with the Iranian Revolution. I mean, here was one group in the Middle East that did have experience with Russia and was not very pleased with the experience that it did have. And so, with the Iranian Revolution being both anti-Western and anti-Soviet simultaneously, this was something new. And, whereas they could talk themselves into believing that Arab nationalists would become Marxist-Leninists, there was no such illusion when it came to Islamic fundamentalists, or however else one wants to call them. I'd also just draw your attention to the speeches of Osama bin Laden. That if you look at his collective speeches, one thing that's it was so fascinating to me is he never forgot the cause of Muslims inside of Russia. He constantly drew attention to their plight. This was something, in other words, that he had in mind. And so I think that, by the time that we come to Putin, and his first crisis is essentially, rebellion in Chechnya. And they had experienced the Afghanistan, where it wasn't just the West that opposed them, but much of the Muslim world were supporting the Afghan Mujahideen. This ideology was making inroads into Soviet Central Asia, etc. This was very bad, and they saw the whole conflict in Chechnya as something very similar. And I think this was, even more than competition with the United States. Putin's initial outreach to Arab governments in particular was to make sure they were not supportive of the Chechen rebellion. This was something because it wouldn't just stop in Chechnya. There are lots of other Muslim peoples in Russia that could have fought as well. And so, in the very beginning of the Putin administration, I wrote about this, and essentially, Putin's initial view of Saudi Arabia was much like America's view of Iran, that this was a revolutionary power, and that they were out to get Russia, that the West was deluded about the true nature of it. And it wasn't until 2003, when then Crown Prince Abdullah visited Moscow, that there would be a rapprochement between Putin and the Saudis, and that basically the Saudis, they had been supporting the Chechens in many ways, but that basically they came to an understanding, and this was one of the most important developments, I think, in Putin's relationship with the Arab world, was his initial Saudi-Russian rapprochement.
Now, one aspect of the Cold War in the Middle East is that, and particularly Soviet foreign policy, is one always sees this argument that the Soviets equipped the Egyptian army, they get defeated in 56. They then equipped the Egyptian and Syrian army, they get defeated in 67. And then 73, they get defeated again. And I'm wondering how much that spillover effect of competition with the United States, in sense of, who's more superior conventionally in general as a aspect of the power equation, plays in the present situation. Because the United States, of course, is using the most advanced conventional weapons it has in its arsenal in its war against Iran. Yet, the issue of how that affects Russia, of course, is an ally of Iran in this present situation, and they have joint production agreements, for example, with drones to be used in Ukraine, etc. So I'm wondering how much of that aspect of the arms kind of competition of the Soviet Union with the United States in the Middle East, how much that has spilled over into the present, or hasn't it?
Well, that's a good question. I just point out in 56, basically the Arab side comes out pretty well. In other words, that the Israeli, British, French attack in Sinai is reversed, and it's the Eisenhower administration that tells them to get out, and they do. But that the Soviets claim credit, and Nasser, for his own purposes, basically, I think he thinks that he won. In other words, I'm not angry with the Soviets for 56. Is that was a great success as far as they're concerned.
That they survived, yeah.
Right. Now 67, even then, you don't have, it was over with so quickly. Obviously, there was a lot of anger and disappointment, that's for sure, but it was over with so quickly, and it was so shocking. And then they spent several years, building these Arab armies, Syrian army, Egyptian army in particular, back up. And then in 73, at first, I remember living through that. At first, it seems that they're doing well against the Israelis, but after a couple of days, it starts to turn the other way. And this is where I think a lot of Egyptians are very unhappy that, why aren't the Soviets giving them the same means that the Americans are giving to the Israelis? That, what is it the Soviets want? They're here in Egypt. Remember, they had something like 20,000 advisors at a certain point. That even certain Soviet naval bases, Egyptians were not allowed to enter without permission from the Soviets. That they had their own agenda, basically, and it wasn't Egypt's agenda. And when after Nasser died, I think Sadat's basic idea is that we're not going to be able to take this territory back by force, even though he does go ahead with the 73 war, but that we're going to have to talk with the Israelis at some point, and that for that we need the Americans. So there's that the Soviets, who had broken relations with Israel in 67, in solidarity with the Arabs. Well, it turned out to be not so useful for Sadat that they had done that. And so there was just, a lot of disappointment And you know it's elsewhere too. In other words, they don't necessarily do what Sadat did, other Arab countries, but they're not happy with the level of Soviet assistance that they're getting. And basically, from the Soviet point of view, is that they didn't want peace to break out necessarily, but they didn't want all-out war either, which they weren't prepared to intervene in. They just wanted the pot to be simmering, not boiling over. And the trouble was that it's you know it's very hard if you're trying to keep a pot simmering permanently. Sometimes it does start to boil on you, and we see this having happened. So there was a lot of Arab disillusionment, and I remember seeing Soviet articles at the time is that Arabs were complaining that the quality of the Soviet weapons wasn't as good as the American weapons, and Soviets basically, no, our weapons are fine. It's the quality of the people using those weapons that is lacking. Soviets were never shy about dissing Arab armies. Anyway, there was they just didn't get there was neither the Arabs didn't get what as much as they were hoping for from the Soviets. It didn't work out as well as they had hoped. Now, if you want to, fast forward, I think that Putin did pretty well for a long time. In other words, that the U.S. obviously did not do well in either Afghanistan or Iraq. 2015, Russia intervenes in Syria. Lo and behold, it seems to be so successful with far fewer men. Now, of course, the real case was that the Iranians were there, Hezbollah was there. Didn't need a large Russian intervention, but it seemed that the Russians were just, much more successful than the Americans were. Then, of course, they get involved in the war in Ukraine. And then 2024, the Assad regime collapses. Well, let me tell you, in the Arab world, Russia's reputation as a defender has pretty much collapsed. In other words, that if they couldn't keep Assad in power, well, what else could they not do? So I think that in a lot of Arab countries, in fact, I think what's so interesting about the current war between the U.S., Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other is just that the low-key role that the Russians are playing. It's been reported that they have provided targeting assistance to the Iranians, and I believe that this is accurate. But what they've also done is that they have not come out and sided with Iran against the U.S. and Israel. And certainly, they are keeping good relations with all the Arab partners. In other words, that they are offering their mediation services, which no one seems to want this time around. But they are since the collapse of the Assad regime, they've played less of a role in the Middle East. Now, it's a function of their war in Ukraine. If and when that comes to an end, I suspect that we'll see renewed Russian attention to the Middle East if they're able to do it. But that's the thing. In other words, that for those Arab governments in recent years who thought, well, the Americans aren't reliable protectors, well, who else is? And really, the only other country willing to get militarily involved in the Middle East was Russia. There was no one else is willing to send troops to fight there. The Russians were to some extent, and so that was and that they seemed to be successul at it. But now that's no longer the case. That they're not seen as very good defenders. I think what's important to understand about whatever success Russia has had in the Middle East, whether recently or in times past, is because there have been actors in the Middle East who have wanted Soviet or Russian presence there. They have benefited from that. And now it's like even if they want it, are they going to get all that much from it? And so, uh, so yeah, it's uh, uh,
Okay, so let's talk about the relationship of Russia with OPEC and the whole question of the relationship with Arabia. Because when we saw the start of this conflict, when Israel was an active participant in this latest phase of the air campaign, Trump agreed to have Russian oil sold so he could depress the prices of oil to keep the domestic situation in the United States and also globally under quote control. So just give a sense of how you see that aspect of it, because you've written about Arabia and all that. Well, how do you see that?
yeah, that's truly shocking, truly shocking. I think what President Trump has done. But let's go back. OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, uh, led by Saudi Arabia. Neither the Soviet Union nor Russia would join uh, in the past. In other words, that they basically, um, in other words, what does OPEC do? In other words, the members of OPEC, they cut back on production. They agree to limit each nation's production for the benefit of increasing oil prices. Well, the Soviets, they would never agree to limit their production. Certainly, Russia would not do so. They were essentially free riders. Um, Now, what happened was that in the past, the Saudis have punished uh, you know outside of OPEC producers who've produced more than the Saudis have wanted them to, and that is that Saudis can always increase production, leading to lower prices. And since they are, one of the lowest cost producers of oil, they can get by, whereas other people with higher production costs can't. And usually, this discipline works. Now, there were times, in the early Putin years, when something like this would happen, and the Russians would talk about, oh, they would say, our oil companies, it's like America, they're private companies. We don't control them or anything. They make their own decisions. And there was some kind of agreement to hold back on production, which they would never honor. Okay. Well, at a certain point, that the Russians, partly to improve their relations with Saudi Arabia, I think it's 2016, that there's something called OPEC Plus comes into being. That it's Saudis and OPEC talk with Russians and other sort of former Soviet producers, and that they sort of more informally agree on quotas. And this would be and the impetus for this was American shale and Canadian shale.
Mm.
In other words, that this was starting to eat into their market, and they basically figured that let's work together and we'll keep the price low enough so that this will drive the American shale producers out of the market. These were a lot of little farms, at the beginning of the shale revolution, borrowing a lot of money, etc.
Let
All
me
right.
interject something on that. It was very funny because Jeffrey Sachs had a 2 day conference in Colombia where all those guys did was come and argue about how we're going to knock everybody out of the world with the shale production. But go on.
Okay. So basically, they now what they really want, of course, are higher prices, and at some point they have to kind of agree to quotas, whatever. So the Saudis got this agreement with the Russians, and in 2020, basically, what the Saudis decide is that we need to cut back on OPEC plus production. Further, we can do this. We can raise prices, and Putin gets it in mind that he doesn't need the Saudis anymore, that actually no, Russia's going to increase its production. And they had this argument, the Russian economists, that, well, you see, if you look at the budget deficits of the two countries, Saudi budget, in other words, the Saudi budget required oil at $100 a barrel. I'm just making this figure up,
Mhm.
whereas Russia only required, let's say, $50 a barrel. Therefore, Russia could afford to produce more to lower cost, get more buyers. Well, if this was their thinking, the Saudis schooled them. And you recall, in the early months of 2020, they flooded the market, to such an extent that the futures price of oil fell below zero. You had to actually pay people to take oil, and that the Russians basically were brought back into the fold. That there was whatever your argument about what you need to fund your budget. Forget it. In other words, it's cost of production that counts, and our ability, the Saudis' ability to flood the market, that you need to be thinking about. And the Russians basically had to fall into line. So they have decided that it was prudent to work with the Saudis essentially since then on oil production. Now, once we have the 2022 war in Ukraine start, and you have Western sanctions on Russian oil exports, well, the only way for Russia to sell this is at a discount. So, yeah, even if they're within the OPEC plus bounds, if you're China or you're India, well, India in particular, you know, what is preferable? Buying Russian oil at much less than Saudi oil? That seems like, and the Indians, vastly step up their purchases of Russian oil, something that they hadn't relied on all that much before. But so here's what they did: they bought the oil. So, in fact, even the Saudis themselves, during the Ukraine war, they decided that they were better off buying discounted Russian oil to sell in their own domestic market in order to have more Saudi oil to sell at full price to those who wouldn't buy Russian oil. So it's very complicated in terms of how this has worked, but basically they kind of all learn to live with this situation. Like if you can't, in other words, if Russian oil is going to be sold at a discount, this obviously is not good for Saudi Arabia. What's the best way for Saudi Arabia to proceed? And this was the solution they came up with. All right, so then we see that the U.S. It doesn't just focus on one enemy at a time. It seems to have lots of enemies, and we're sanctioning Iranian oil, we're sanctioning Russian oil. And basically, once we go to war with Iran, the Trump administration, as we all know, seems to have a soft spot for Putin. They basically regard Iran, a country less capable than Russia militarily, as somehow more of a threat to the U.S. And so basically, it's like to hurt Iran, we remove the sanctions on Russian oil, at least for a while. And you can imagine that Putin didn't exactly hold back. In other words, it's like, oh no, we're not going to take advantage of our Iranian friends and sell more oil because Trump is willing to let us do so. Oh no, they took full advantage of the ability to sell more of their oil at Iran's expense, basically.
Well,
Yeah.
we'll get to Iran in a moment. One other question before we get to Iran, and then Alex will bring you in there, is the whole issue of the color revolutions and how, because a lot's made of that in terms of Putin's response in general to that. But you argue how the Arab Spring had an impact on Putin, and then of course you had all these events going on in Europe. The 2014 Maidan rebellion. I mean, explain how that factors into Putin's grand strategy.
Right. Essentially, Putin, well, to begin with, he doesn't really believe that democracy exists in the West. In other words, he has a very Soviet view that's all, sort of ruling circles and corporations and cabals, etc. And so what passes for democracy really isn't democracy. But that what the West has succeeded in doing is fooling people into thinking that if they overthrow a pro-Russian authoritarian regime, they're going to get democracy. Really, all they're going to get is a pro-Western authoritarian regime. And that essentially, fundamentally, what he doesn't think that there's any real agency within other countries. In other words, small countries do as they're told. And so if there is a democratic revolutionary movement, well, obviously this is something that the US must have orchestrated because, it just couldn't happen. Now, there was this book by the two Brookings scholars, Fiona Hill and Clifford Gutty, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, that, one of the most formative experiences of his life was the 1989 the political changes in East Germany in particular, right, and the mob surging forth. Right. And he's out there arguing with them. No, nothing's happening in here. And in the meantime, his colleagues are burning documents in the KGB ovens or whatever they had in there. That this is what he fears. And of course, what happened to Libya's Gaddafi, confirmed this. But in other words, he does not see these as indigenous popular movements at all, that they're somehow orchestrated from abroad, and that they always seem to be orchestrated against regimes that Russia has good relations with. And of course, the ultimate goal is to have such a revolution in Russia itself. And now, I would argue that democracy would be a great thing for Russia, that Russians would be much better off. Clearly, the Putin regime would not be better off, but he just doesn't see it that way. In other words, if it's any kind of democratic revolution is actually orchestrated to benefit the United States, basically. So that's what he sees as, and that's what he fears, that his own people, could be susceptible to the siren songs of Western propaganda. He's very much afraid of this. And so, I think for Putin in particular, it's always, I think, the Westerners have tended to think that, well, if we have a choice between having good relations with someone or bad relations with someone, wouldn't it be nice to have good relations with someone? And of course, with Russia, there was all this tremendous hope at the end of the Cold War. Basically, I think Putin has always felt that good relations with the West is something that would be harmful for him, that the better relations that the West has with Russia, the more penetration of Russia there is. And there was already far too much of that, by the time he came to power. And so he shut them down, declared them, anyone cooperating with Western funders as foreign agents. And basically, I think he feels that he benefits from a hostile atmosphere.
Interesting. Now,
he's got it.
Finally, let me just ask you before I turn to Alex, and I'm sort of throwing a softball here to Irvine. The situation with Putin with Iran at this point, and you could go back and, I do not confess to be aware of the Soviet reaction to the overthrow of Mossadegh. But, how do you see Russia's policy right now in the situation that we're in with Iran?
Well, first of all, I think what's interesting is if you go back and look at the Soviet reaction, they didn't do much for him. They didn't much like him. They didn't. He wasn't one of theirs as far as the Soviets were concerned. Sorry. Now, I think in terms of the Russian-Iranian relationship, that basically there's no real love lost. I was fortunate enough, I visited Iran a couple of times, and certainly visited Russia. A lot of suspicion for the other, that the Iranians remember all the bad things that the Russians have done to them. And the Russians, for their part, they're convinced that the Iranians will make a deal with the Americans first chance they get. and jettison Russia.
Hmm.
That basically, if at a time when Iran has such bad relations with the West, why have they been so rude to Russia over the years? As far as the Russian definition of what is rude, there's always complaining and always, wanting, demanding, etc. They don't, they don't see Iran as sufficiently grateful, shall we say? Okay, now things have changed obviously since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the shocking development of Russia importing Iranian drones, depending on Iranian technology. Prior to this, it was Russia that provided other countries with military technology. It didn't import it. My God. But there they were, and they were dependent on Russia, on Iran, of course, North Korea as well. But basically, in other words, the Iranians, I think, have done a lot for the Russians in this war. But what have the Russians done for the Iranians? Well, they sure haven't done much for the axis of resistance. Did nothing for Hamas when it came under Israeli attack. I mean, they said things, whatever, but they didn't do anything for it. They didn't do anything to protect Hezbollah from Israeli bombardment. Obviously, both Russia and Iran, let Assad fall. But in 2025, the 12-day war, where were the Russians? I remember, there was like a set of statements someone put together about Iranian complaints about just how little Russia has done recently for them. Now, it's been a little different since the 2026 war, Russia providing targeting data. But what I think is interesting is that, Russia, just to go back to what you said at the very beginning of this session, Russia and Iran are allies. No, they're not allies. They don't have any agreement to come to each other's defense. They refer to each other as strategic partners. This is this strange term, which means, you can be anything but not reliable allies. That's the one thing it doesn't mean is that you're not committed to each other's defense. What Russia and Iran have helped each other do is attack or is to fight the other one's enemies. Neither has helped defend the other one directly. So in this war, Russia helped Iran launch targets in the Gulf Arabs, Israel, just wherever. But they have not done anything to defend Iranian territory, Iranian personnel. In other words, the Russians need to be perfectly satisfied to let that happen. They have not done anything to help, defend. They help, but the other one attack. And essentially, I think that for both Russia and Iran, the other one's wars were useful. In other words, that to the extent that the other one was at war with, common set of adversaries or similar ones, that was good because that meant less, the more American support going for Ukraine in the past, well, that was not something that Iran had to worry about. Now it's like, the more American weapons expended on Iran, well, that's not going to Ukraine, is it? That's not helping the Ukrainians. And so the other one's conflicts were sort of a bit of a benefit. But what we've seen recently is that there have been now some costs, because what's happened? Some of the Gulf Arab countries have now turned to Ukraine for air defense support. Now that has been a real blow. I mean, they never had much interest in Ukraine. They were never going to help Ukraine because the Americans said it was the right thing to do. They were never going to limit their own interaction with Russia. Suddenly, they came under attack from Iran with, Russian-supplied technology. Who do they turn to but Ukraine, who's got a lot of experience dealing with incoming Iranian drones? This has not been in Russia's interest at all. Similarly, what we've seen, just a few weeks ago in the Caspian, Iranian vessel carrying reportedly military equipment from one of Iran's Caspian ports to one of Russia's comes under Ukrainian attack. And of course, the Iranians are furious and they're saying they're going to retaliate. But it's like, from the Ukrainian point of view, is that we're already under Iranian attack. What more can you do? There is just not going to. There is the Russians are using Iranian technology to attack them. What more can Iran do that would change the situation that they face? In fact, if Iran ever does attack Ukrainian territory, I think the response will be Ukraine will attack Iranian territory with its missiles. Why not? In other words, that the utility that each had for the other of serving as a distraction factor is not necessarily there anymore,
Hmm.
in my view.
Interesting. All right, thank you. Alex, come on, Alex.
Yeah, again, thanks for again a fascinating historical discussion. Yeah, I hadn't thought about a lot of the other aspects of the Soviet policy that you kind of mentioned, Mark. But yeah, let me start with what you think the kind of interaction between Chinese grand strategy in West Asia and the Russians, and with BRICS and so on.
Good question. Now, I'm not a China expert, and I know I'm sure you'll have someone who is coming on, but it just strikes me that if you look at Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, the argument he basically makes is that in any given situation, the great power that sort of benefits is the one that stays out of conflicts between the main threat to others, kind of comes in at the last minute maybe, but basically it by staying out of things that helps your prospects for being the next great power, if you will. And it seems to me that if there's any beneficiary to these terrible wars that are taking place, it's China. I mean, essentially, the West and Russia are basically expending a lot of energy and effort against each other in Ukraine. I think it's just been a godsend for China that the America and its is expending its resources on Iran. That no one is really focused on China. Everyone, we keep saying, "Oh, we're going to pivot to China. We're going to pivot to Asia because this is the main threat." Well, but we never seem to act that way. We always seem to get ourselves sidetracked with something else. I think that the Trump administration actually persuaded itself that, well, if we're afraid of China and we're so far away from it, surely the Russians, if they're thinking rationally, they must be afraid of China too, deep down.
Right, right.
And therefore, if we have good relations with
Well, not just
Russia,
them. Biden supposedly told Putin at some point, why are you working with
yeah,
or that they're even going to take your Far East.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and certainly, one of my former colleagues at George Mason, she grew up in China, and basically said, every Chinese high school student is taught, is shown maps that this is what Russia stole from China. And that, if you inculcate an entire population with this viewpoint, you cannot give up this claim, permanently. You have to somehow, you're going to return to it at some point. But in any event, right now, I just think that the Chinese couldn't have asked for a better situation. In other words, the one thing that I think the Chinese foreign minister made clear to the EU leader is that China does not want to see Russia lose in Ukraine. That doesn't mean they want to see it win either. They just
Mm,
don't want to see Russia,
right.
fall. But I think that they're very happy with the Americans, the Russians distracted
Sure.
elsewhere, and they can do more of whatever it is that they want. Now, what it is they want, I'm not really qualified to speak on.
Right. And how do you think, the utter incompetence that the Trump administration has shown, how is that, as some people think, changing how, yeah, the country, countries in the Middle East see the U.S. and obvious. I mean, people argue, especially the Gulf states, their whole compact were like, okay, the U.S. is going to defend them, but then, we'll, buy U.S. bonds and we'll invest in the U.S. and we'll, sell you our oil. But this again, and the kind of mess where,
Yeah.
Iranian drones and missiles can, basically, several of the countries could be destroyed if Iran chose to take out their desalination plants. I mean, literally like Kuwait and like 90% of Saudi Arabia would have to leave because they wouldn't have water in the middle of the
Yeah,
summer.
well, I think it's a massive disappointment for them. I think now, I spoke to a lot of Europeans, and they actually feel that really, Trump has done us a favor. We should have always been spending more on our own defense. Now we're doing so because we fear being abandoned. Um, but I think what Trump expected was that, this increased defense expenditure would be on American weapons. No, no, no. The Europeans are building their own weapons.
Right.
And I think that with regard to the Gulf Arabs in particular, is that, you know, um, their disappointment, similar to that of the Europeans, is going to be, more self-reliance instead of buying more American weapons. No, now they, obviously their own defense industries are
Mhm.
not nearly as developed, but Turkey's, or Turkey as we should now say,
Right, right.
is, and I've seen, this Mecca agreement between Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. I think this is fairly serious. That I think it's an important development, and it's kind of like what's happening in
Mhm.
Europe, in the sense that these countries understand that they've got to be more self-reliant, that they cannot rely
Right.
on the others. Whether or not it'll work, who knows?
Mhm.
But and I think this is also happening in Asia. In other words, that we see Japan, the Philippines,
Right.
Australia, in particular, cooperating. And a little more. It's a little looser with India. Uh,
Right. Do
but
you think they could turn to buying Russian weapons? Because I mean, particularly in the case of Russian air defense, that, you can make an argument that, that their S-400 and up and further is better than the Patriot, for example. And
yeah, well, I guess the question now is that does Russia have the capacity,
true, yeah.
given its own needs? In other words, is Russia willing and able to export
Mhm.
much by way of sophisticated weaponry?
Right.
And that, I think, is the problem. In other words, that, and certainly the Iranians have seen that, they've been promised these Su-35s for the longest time, and the Russians just haven't delivered. And it's even believed that they actually exist. They don't have to be built.
Right.
The Russians seem to have other ideas for them. So it's I think that a lot of other countries are worried. In other words, that before
Mhm.
2022, Russia seemed like a great arms supplier. They didn't ask questions, nothing about human rights or
Right.
democracy. Not that I mean, really did this very seriously, but even the little bit of pushback we gave on this was too much for some of them. Or the Russians, this wasn't the case at all. And so, I think that Russia is not seen as the most reliable arms supplier. But now there are some others. Turkey in particular, South Korea, even Ukraine is able to export air defense capacity. Brazil, I think it's sort of the era of the regional powers that are benefiting from sort of the incapacity, if you will. And of course, China itself is no slouch. Now, obviously, they're not going to be
Yeah.
exporting weapons to their people who are fearful of them. But I think that there's a lot of
Right.
capacity out there
Right. And
for.
they've already sold some equipment. I mean, the Saudis and way back, well, the Iranians had, Chinese silkworms, but again, they've sold, was it whichever the plane that the Pakistanis used to shoot down a number of actually
Right.
for French Rafale planes, and when they had that big border clash where the Pakistanis came out ahead.
Yeah, yeah, it's yes, it's yeah, there are plenty of suppliers out there. That's the thing, and
Mm.
and suppliers who are not currently at war, needing their own capacity. So, and so basically, I think that if what the Trump administration wants, that national security document they released last November, is that if they want to pull back and let other parts of the world take care of themselves, well, that may well happen. Maybe that's even a good thing for those other countries. But what it'll mean is that the U.S. is just that much less listened to. In other words, that there was a real demand for our services as a great power. If we're not going to provide those services, countries are going to make other arrangements. And
Of course, yeah.
I think that in other words, it's not going to be a world more amenable to American influence.
Right. One thing that's interesting about what you said is if you could go in, and anybody else want to ask questions, please raise your hand, is your interpretation and take on this alliance or document that was signed between Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey.
Well, I know everyone denies it, but I see it as the Sunni alliance. Three Sunni great powers in the region working together. I think that it has implications for the Israelis. Not that I see them as wanting to, I think what's interesting is that however much Muslim public opinion supports Palestinians, Muslim governments, these Sunni governments, have no real interest in going out of their way to support them. I think it has implications for Iran. Turkey and Pakistan bordering Iran, Saudi Arabia, essentially on its southern maritime border. I know that the Iranians have said that they don't see it as a threat, but I don't think they're being invited. I don't think they're being invited to join this Mecca Accord. The difference is that what I see it is more like of a traditional 19th century European alliance. In other words, unlike the American 20th century alliances, which the U.S. was the leader, a lot of smaller followers, and so the U.S. sort of had a role in kind of smoothing relations among the fractious allies. That when you have alliances among more or less equals, that these are harder to keep together. In other words, that they really have to, come to an agreement on what the threats are. I think that with the Mecca Accord, one thing we're not going to see Turkey and Saudi Arabia do is support Pakistan against India. That's just not going to happen. And so it's like looking inward toward the Middle East. I think it also has implications for the one serious Abraham Accord between the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Israel, which really is they do cooperate extensively. But I have a feeling that in other words, sort of with the Biden administration, the Trump administration sort of envisioned a world of, ever spreading Abraham Accords, with Israel having good relations with so many of these other Muslim governments, and this would be the greatest thing. No, this is not going to spread. That the only really meaningful one is between Israel and the UAE, and at a certain point, it seems to me that the UAE would needs to follow the Saudi lead at some point. At least that's my view of a lot of Saudis as well.
Interesting.
Maybe that's wrong, but I think that I personally think that that in other words that just like Europe has responded with increased defense expenditures plus informal alliance arrangements. In other words, I forget what this one is called. When Britain, the Nordics, the Baltics, in other words, they have their own like within NATO defense cooperation segments. That what we see in the Middle East is something similar. How successful it will be, I don't know. And I think we're seeing something in the Far East as well. Japan, Philippines, Australia, and I would even include Taiwan in this group. That's what we're seeing. And that has been the result of the Trump administration policy.
Yes, exactly. Urban, do you have some comments about what we've been talking about Russia and Iran and all that? You kind of mute.
Yeah, I mean, the conventional wisdom on Iran and the Soviet Union is that, the Soviet Union was a hungry bear that ready to gobble up Iran to get to the warm seas and so on. That's the conventional view. My reading is somewhat different. I think the Soviet policy towards Iran was very much basically based on the 1921 agreement between the Soviet Union and Iran. Remember, in 21, the Red Army actually chased the British army that had intervened in the Russian Civil War into Iran. And part of the agreement between the two countries was that as long as there was no third party of military force in Iran, the Soviet Union would basically keep out of Iranian politics, would basically recognize Iran's sovereignty. And at that time, the word neutralism wasn't used, but it would respect it. And my reading is actually they followed that pretty much throughout the Soviet history. And even in 1951, actually, when Britain was tempted to invade Iran when oil was nationalized, there were a number of reasons given why Britain didn't invade. But my reading of the documents was that the U.S. actually put pressure on Britain not to invade because the U.S. was worried that if the British invaded southern Iran, the Soviet Union would have the legal right to actually invade Iran because that was part of the treaty. So the notion somehow that the Soviet Union was obsessed about getting Iran, I think, is misreading of the Cold War. But that doesn't fit into the actual conventional wisdom of the Cold War. My question actually to Mark is how familiar are the present-day Russians foreign ministry aware of the 21 agreement? I mean, partly, I mean, Russia is no longer a direct neighbor of Iran, but are they still aware that there is such an agreement? And if the United States actually tried to invade the southern parts of Iran, the Russians would have a legal right to invade Iran or not?
Very good question. I have to admit my contacts with the Russian Foreign Ministry are
not up to snuff, right?
Not stuff. Now, but I do know, I used to be in contact with the what they call their Oriental Institute, which is, focused on the Middle East. And certainly, they have, real genuine Iran specialists there. And I think they're very much aware of this 1921 treaty. The difference, though, is that, but it's one thing being aware of the treaty. Is another thing to, but what could they actually do? In other words, so long as they're distracted by the war in Ukraine, the capacity of the Russians to do something like this, I think, is fairly limited. Although maybe they wouldn't have to do that. It's the question you raise is so interesting. I was a participant in 2 role-playing games in which there was a U.S.-Israeli threat to Iran. And the question was, what would the Russians do? Now, in both games, and they were held under very different circumstances, one was in my classroom, another one was, well, I can't tell you what it was. But in any event, in both of these games, the team playing Russia, they sent a small number of troops to deploy around certain key Iranian targets. And basically that served to cause the US and Israel to back off in those role-playing games. But as we know, those are not real life. I thought last year during the 12-day war, that's what Russia would do. It didn't. It didn't. I thought that they would send a small number of troops. Now, obviously, the Iranians didn't invite this. Russia didn't do it, and they obviously haven't done it this year as well. But it does strike me that in extremis, this is an option. In other words, it's not a question of even Russia invading. It's a question of simply Russia responding to a request made by Iran under the 1921 treaty terms for Russian support, and Russia responding to it. Could they do it? No, I think that so long as they're involved in Ukraine, it will be very difficult to do more than what I've suggested. But to get to your earlier point about the conventional wisdom, I think that the image of in the West of the Soviet relationship with Iran is linked to the crisis at the very beginning of the Cold War, when Soviet troops did not withdraw from Iran on the schedule that they had agreed to with the British. And there's sort of two narratives of there's actually three narratives of what got them to actually withdraw. One is that the U.S. stood up to them and told them that they had better withdraw or else, and so they withdrew. That's one.
This is 46, by the way, you're talking about.
Yeah. Another is that the Shah of Iran basically persuaded the Russians that if they withdrew, they would get oil concessions. Just like, of course, the Majlis would have to approve, but once they withdrew, things would be fine. They withdrew, and the Majlis, of course, did not approve. So, just an example of the Shah being clever. And there's a third explanation. There was an Azeri scholar who sees the remaining in Iran is partly a function of the policy of the Azeri Communist Party, the one in Soviet Azerbaijan, which they had dreams of reuniting Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijanis, under Soviet auspices. And that basically, once Moscow sort of got wind of what they were doing, kind of reined them in. But in any event, whatever it was, that's sort of been the image that the Soviets behaved threateningly. They ended up withdrawing. This was like the beginning of the Cold War. And so that's what made Iran a U.S. ally. What I think is not focused on is that from that point onward, up through 1979, the Shah of Iran actually had fairly decent working relationships with the Soviet Union. He even bought Soviet weapons on at least two occasions. There was trade, there was Soviet assistance, economic assistance, that the Soviet Union and Iran. And in fact, when the Shah seemed to be in danger of falling, the Soviets were not happy with these new people coming in. They knew it wasn't the Tuda, it wasn't the Communist Party. They knew that these people were not friends of the Soviet Union, and it was basically at the point at which the Shah was falling, that's when they basically welcome the incoming group, and then it didn't even work. In other words, the Khomeini company were anti-Soviet when they came in. But you're absolutely right, and I think that the relationship between the Soviets and the Shah is a fascinating subject, and I wish that there was more written on this because it is very instructive. The Shah, and again, it's an example of a smaller power being well able to manage a larger one, and for what all his faults, of course, that the Shah had, that he was pretty good at foreign policy.
Go on, Ron.
Yeah, I mean, to add to the complexity of the early Cold War, it's usually, as you said, it's sort of the Soviet reluctance to withdraw from the northern occupation. But there's a added behind the story of that, which is, again, in the 1921 agreement, the Russians had oil concessions in the north, which they gave up on the understanding it would not be given to someone else. But they discovered at the end of the World War II, it was leaked in the parliament in Iran that actually the Iranian government was secretly negotiating with American and British oil companies to give oil concessions, new oil concessions, precisely in the north. So at that point, they demanded their oil concessions there. So that started off what became known as the Azerbaijan crisis. So usually the history starts with the Soviet demand, refusal to withdraw, or the Soviet demand for oil concession. But if you start the story about the secret negotiations, then it's the oil companies actually that initiated that. And the State Department was actually very reluctant on that because they said this Kennan himself in Moscow reports that this would actually antagonize the Soviets if they give oil concessions, new oil concessions to American or British companies. So the question is, who is the actor? Who's the initiator of the early Cold War? It's not that easy. Stalin may have been an SOB, but he was not necessarily always wrong. There were other parties to this. And to say something about the Shah, however pro-Western he was, he even sent actually help to United States in Vietnam. He was the biggest buyer of American arms and so on. He actually observed the 1921 agreement. He never actually put American bases in Iran because he knew that was a no-no. So here there was in a way, a lot of hypocrisy. He would say, the Soviet Union is the major threat. America has to sell me all the arms I need. In the same mouth, whenever he came to Washington, he would say, "Oh, if you don't sell me these arms, I'll go to the Soviet Union." I mean, it's like saying, the bear is threat. The bear is a danger, but I'll go and hug the bear if you don't do what I want. I mean, it's complete hypocrisy. But no one in Washington was willing to call the hypocrisy because there was good business selling arms.
That's right, and it worked, up until the point in which it didn't for him. His foreign policy, I think, was a success. It was his domestic policy that
it worked, but the patients of Antitrade died.
Right. Let me bring Michael in. Michael, go on, Mike.
Yeah, I wanted to look at this from a slightly different aspect, which is the rise of, or it's always been there, of basically, I'll go even further than saying religious fundamentalism, but religious fanaticism, which is, by the way, not limited to Islamic. We've seen it Christian, we've seen it Hindu, every religion. We're now even seeing it with Jewish fundamentalism on the right wing in Israel. But with this rise of this type of attitude, in where the primary end goal of regimes that are based in this, if not the exclusive end goal, is, of course, to have this religious fundamentalist state and to export it in many cases. In other words, religious fundamentalism has always been there. The fact is, though, what would Putin's plan be, seeing that he is not a religious fundamentalist, despite the statement he once said where we're going to go to heaven and they're going to go to hell. But how does he plan? What would be his plan going forward to deal with this issue? Because it's becoming almost there's another bipolar world, which is the people who are fanatical and the people who are not. How do you think he is going to try to maneuver that, especially given the situation that he's in now?
And just to add to that, the whole question of ISIS. Go on, Mark.
Well, I think that Putin is he does use Orthodox Christian fundamentalism, that this is something that he does promote. I think that I don't think he's not uncomfortable with Shia fundamentalism. Certainly, he sees in the West, in the U.S., Christian fundamentalists as his allies. In other words, I think that what Putin has basically tried to promote, sort of conservative Christian values, which of course are shared by other religions, against transgenderism. This is always the big bugaboo that they talk about, that DEI, that this is, in other words, that there are, sort of normal people, if you will, adhere to these kinds of fairly common religious values against this, it's secular Western liberals who are the exception, that they are the ones who are undermining everyone else, and that this message meets a response. Obviously, certainly it has. I think in the United States, certainly in parts of Europe as well, that there are. I think the real problem that the West as a whole is facing is the demographic transformation. When the U.S. Census Bureau released the information that by the 2040s, America will be a majority minority country. Anyone who teaches at a university knows that this transition's already happened in the college age population and younger. That this is something that a lot of people consider very, very threatening, and democracy is not a means to contain what they see as a threat. In fact, it enables the threat if these people can vote. And therefore, there has to be something better, if you will, and that is a religiously based vision of the world. And so I think that Putin is very happy to play into that. But you mentioned ISIS. Now, ISIS, whether it's Al Qaeda or the Taliban or a lot of other jihadist groups, they have followed the trajectory of a lot of other revolutionaries, and that is they have sort of moderated to a certain extent. Obviously, the women of the world will not. Obviously, they don't see it as their policies as moderate, but that they have, as we see in Syria now, the President Shara, in his nice Western suit, and he's willing to do business with everyone. Now, this guy was in Al Qaeda. ISIS seems to be different so far. In other words, that these guys are not moderating. That they're not only against the West, they're even against the Taliban. My God, the Taliban aren't good enough for them. That they have to be fighting them. So I think that ISIS has marked itself as a common threat. In fact, that's the basis of Putin's recognition of the Taliban. The one country that's recognized the Taliban government is Russia, and partly on the basis of needing to cooperate against the common ISIS threat is what they cite. So I wouldn't, in other words, so it's interesting. In other words, like, there are certain conservative groups that can be, on the one hand, allied against the secular West. On the other hand, they're allied against, ISIS, which is even too much for them. So there's sort of a common, and I think, and Iran is sort of part of this. In other words, that Shia fundamentalism poses no threat to Russia. They, and they face, they have faced Sunni jihadism in the past as well. So I think that, Putin has this vision of this grander coalition, sort of, kind of religiously oriented, even if people like Putin himself might not be that religion, but although he claims to be, against the secular West and against, of course, ISIS. So that's I think his vision, that he's comfortable, I think, with a fundamentalism, as long as it stays in their own countries. They don't want to see Islamic fundamentalism in Russia among Russian Muslims, and hence the outreach to Muslim governments.
But in other words, but as we saw in, for instance, Afghanistan, as the United States saw in Afghanistan, I remember in the 1980s, when Russia was embroiled, Soviet Union was embroiled in the mess there. 8 Soviet soldiers were found beheaded, and I was talking to people, and I just said, I think we're backing the wrong side. The idea of the extremism can come back and bite you. We saw it on 9/11 also. If you support that kind of, let's say, fanaticism, it may come back and hit you in a way that you had not foreseen. I mean, is Putin, for instance, how is he gearing himself for that? Because he's seen it happen in the past.
I think that when he first came into office, and then of course 9/11 occurred, his argument was that, Russia and America should be allied together because we're facing a common jihadist threat, whether it's Al Qaeda, whether it's the Chechens or whatever. And then, of course, the U.S. went ahead and intervened in Iraq, or overthrew the secular Ba'athist Party, and part of Putin's objection was not only was he, they were getting along with Saddam Hussein, but that you're just going to empower jihadists. And in many respects, we saw the rise of ISIS in Iraq, and that's certainly in the Sahel. We haven't really talked about that. The Russians have displaced the French, helping governments fight against jihadists, but they sure haven't defeated those jihadists. And there you have Russians directly at odds with them. Basically, they've put themselves in the line of fire. The French were there. They insisted on taking the French place, thinking they could do better. Well, they couldn't. So the Russians are not. They haven't escaped from the jihadist threat. You can get along with some Muslims who are also threatened by these jihadists. But yeah, I think it's the world is it's not even though other conflicts are now occurring and taking more time and attention. What these folks are doing is they're still there, and just like the Chinese, they're benefiting from the preoccupation of the great powers in other parts of the world, I think, but we're going to see more of a difficult situation there.
Well, that's interesting that Are you familiar with Soviet foreign policy in Africa?
Of course, yes.
Okay, well that'd be a whole other separate discussion, because trust me, we could easily launch into that. Michael, you have any other comments or questions?
No, great answer.
All right, well, thank you. And I just wanted to read a question from Martin, as saying, during the Soviet times, the Kurds went through many ugly challenges, as we know. Today, the Kurds' significance in Iraq is growing due to oil redirection, while their situation in Syria remains uncertain. How does Mark view the Russian approach to the Kurds? And that's a really interesting question.
It is an interesting question. And basically, ever since, I think, the time of Catherine the Great, the Russians have off and on helped the Kurds. And the Kurds have essentially looked to Russians as saviors, even when the Russians pull the rug out from under them. That basically the Russians have helped the Kurds, whenever they're at odds with the governments that the Kurds are at odds with. But basically, once the Russians improve relations with those governments, then they're not so interested in the Kurds. Now, of course, it's complicated. We now have this, Kurdish regional government. Certainly there have been Russian oil firms, active in this area as well. Russia's relations with Turkey, it was pretty bad at one point. now it's good that the Russians play host to various Kurdish conferences. They, in Syria, what they tried to do was to talk the Kurds into joining forces with the Assad regime against the common enemy, ISIS, that the Americans were going to leave anyway, so you may as well, work with us. And of course, the Kurds didn't quite see it that way. It's never, in other words, that they will always, what's the term, breadcrumb the Kurds. In other words, they always have given them some support, but never enough to, get the Kurds what they want in terms of establishing independence. But they're always there, and always giving hope to the Kurds. And the Kurds, there's not many people doing even this. So the Kurds seem to very much, admire the Russians, and I think will continue to do so. It's just something that they have, that they can always play with, and that they will. In other words, that because whatever little the Russians have done for the Kurds, well, who's done anything more? That in fact, most people have done a lot less. They've actually gone out of their way to hurt them because they're supporting governments that don't like them.
And Martin, doesn't that contrast with the U.S. that's abandoned the Kurds repeatedly? We have Kissinger, and in the case with abandoning them to when the Iranians and the Iraqis made that deal in the 70s with the Shah. That kind of
Well, even this most recent episode in 2026, I think it was the Jerusalem Post, reveal this great plan that Netanyahu had for Trump, and that is that we support the Kurds. The Kurds will march into Iran, not carrying Kurdish flags, but imperial Iranian flags, and that as the Kurds move in, then the Iranian people will all rise up. And it's like, well, what do the Kurds get? In the end, and I think that the Kurds are very sensible, and that they sort of didn't they didn't want to be the foot soldiers, basically, for the West and for Trump in particular. And when Trump's first term, it was the U.S. relied on the Kurds to help us defeat ISIS in Syria. Once that appeared to be done, basically Trump essentially was quite publicly willing to ditch the Kurds, saying, where were they on D-Day? It's like, well, it wasn't an independent state. It just shows, but a massive lack of appreciation.
Right.
That was what I think the Kurds understood, that they had no appreciation.
It's absolutely obscene, his comments on that.
So if that's the kind of treatment they're getting, maybe the Russians don't seem like such a bad deal.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
They might not help you that much, but they don't lie about what they're going to do and not do for you. That the Russians, they have some working relationship, ongoing relationship with the Russians, which they feel is going to continue.
I'm going to get to Frank in a second, and we'll sort of close out with these comments. I saw Netanyahu make a comment about Britain, which was quite interesting. The one that it's the first Islamic nuclear state. And this gets into the issues you raised earlier about how Putin is relating to the conservative use of Christian fundamentalism and right-wing ideology to sort of ally themselves with people in Europe. Because always when I have arguments with people about Ukraine, I said, well, look at what he's doing with all these right-wing movements in Europe that he's allied with or helping to support. And Doug, and I'll get to you in a second, Frank, Doug raises an interesting question about something that has to do with what we're going through now. You alluded earlier to the grand strategy document of this latest rendition of the Trump administration, which essentially talked about retreating into the Western Hemisphere to defend it. But what is your analysis? Because the book we talked about did deal with grand strategy. What is your sense of what U.S. grand strategy is right now?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I think think Russia's a lot easier country to understand than the United States. I've often felt that it's just easier to understand Russia. One guy makes decisions, and that's you just have to sort of be attuned to him.
Well, we're sort of in that situation right now. One guy once was trying to make all the decisions. Go on.
Right? Yeah. I guess the comparison is that Putin, however realistic or unrealistic it is, he seems to have an actual strategy. He's defined, who his enemies are, who his potential friends are, and he's acted on that basis. I think with the Trump administration, what has happened is that basically he's upended that. In other words, those whom we were traditionally regarded as friends, Trump does not regard as friends. He regards as people who are taking advantage of, and that those who have been adversaries are people who he can make deals with, even though he's not been able to do this so far. The Russians have strung him along. The North Koreans strung him along for some reason. The thing about the Iranians is that they won't even bother to string him along. They will not feed his ego by letting him think that they would make a bargain. I mean, because they could be like Putin or like Kim Jong-un or whomever, but they haven't even done that, and I think that's what disturbs him. So I think at a time when he regards immigration as the greatest threat, and I've spoken to audiences and where that's what a lot of people in America do think, immigration is the greatest threat, and that therefore we can't focus on other things. In other words, just like I always try to point out, well, great powers have to multitask. Even if you regard immigration as a threat, that doesn't mean there aren't other threats that you have to be concerned about. And then, of course, the basic question: is it a threat at all? In other words, I grew up 100 miles from the Mexican border. I remember growing up in the 60s in California, and people still talking about how the Eisenhower administration's Operation Wetback, which expelled hundreds of thousands. What happened to our orange groves, our avocado groves, that all those people essentially had to be let back in at some point. And I truly think that's what we're going to find, that, at a time when in so many parts of the world populations are shrinking, that the battle for the future will be which parts of the world are able to import labor from those fewer parts of the world that are producing excess labor. That we have gotten it backward at present by thinking that immigrants are a problem, and I think we're seeing it in our economy now, and so that's, I think, the real problem. In other words, that we are not focusing on our grand strategy on an international basis. In other words, the grand strategy, such as it is simply domestic politics.
Correct.
And whenever a country subordinates its international interests to its domestic politics, well, international relations is not a forgiving field. In other words, that there's no forgiveness for screwing things up.
No, you're right about that, because any objective economic studies show that this anti-deportation policy objectively hurts the United States. And I myself have lived in California, I've lived in Arizona, I live in New York, and it's, to me, almost quasi-absurd, the xenophobia, because everybody who worked in New York, how many people knew people who were undocumented and who were trying to get a leg up, and nobody ever had this attitude, you have to leave, you have to be thrown out. It's nuts. But anyway, Frank, go on, Frank.
Yes, you mentioned the Soviet Union quite a bit here. Russia is not the Soviet Union anymore. It's like the United Kingdom. It is an ever-diminishing power. It has fossil fuels. It is not a competitive factor in AI. It's not a competitive in anything. It has what it's learned from the war, so it's good at electronic warfare, and it's good with drone warfare. It has Rubicon. That's about all it can really seriously export as far as its defense industries. It is, as you mentioned, it's got a vulnerability in the Far East. China is the hegemonic power that is coming up on the outside. And the United States is trying to cling to some kind of strategy, which nobody seems to understand, to include Trump. And we have Putin with a strategy, but that is also subject to change over time. It's, if clean energy, solar and whatever's coming out of the low altitude economy of China starts to dominate, then that's even more rapid a decline for Russia. So I'm wondering when China will play its hand. And so I'm asking, at what point does Russia become a vassal state? At what point can it honestly continue with what it's doing? It is totally, well, it's not quite totally dependent upon China right now, but it's getting there. So, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it the lifespan of Putin? Because Russia is about to not collapse, but potentially do a 1917 again. And, China has a lot of cards to play, but it hasn't played them yet. So just what's your attitude towards that?
Well, thank you. I think that's what you say is very important. And just to add to what I was saying earlier and how China has benefited from the current war in the Gulf, and that is, I think the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the longer it lasts, it's simply going to hasten the transition to a non-fossil fuel power sources. And of course, China is leading in this department. So I think this is something that, again, is somewhere where they benefit. I remember being on a Zoom call back before February 2022, when a Russian scholar, a very prominent Russian scholar, it was a Chatham House event, so I can't say who it was, but it was someone who was very much associated with Putin, was talking about just this question. And he himself brought it up. He says, all of China's neighbors, except for Russia, feel threatened by China. China is aggressive towards all its neighbors except for Russia. How long is Russia going to be an exception? He doesn't think forever. In fact, he gave a date, 2036.
Really?
At the date that Putin is no longer, president, but it could be any time up until then. That basically, and this was even before the war in Ukraine. That essentially, that Putin's focus on the West as Russia's enemy has simply blinded him to the potential for China being so, which a lot of Russians fully understand. Now, I think, what Putin would say is that, China is not going to bring about a color revolution in Russia. Or is that whatever else, China might be a classic, great power threat, but it's not a threat to the Putin system the way the West is. And that's what he is focused on. So, I think that we will see something like this. At some point, I think that if the Chinese foreign minister statement that he doesn't want to see Russia lose the war in Ukraine, at a certain point, it strikes me that if the Russians seem to be doing as poorly as they are now into the future, and that they're running out of resources, that I think if China put its foot down, is that we want this war to end now, and we will stop importing anything from anyone who's a party to the conflict. They still have economic relations with Ukraine, but that basically, the impact would be on Russia, and I'm not sure that Russia could continue this war without Chinese support. I think that it might even trigger, sort of a leadership change in Russia. I do think that at some point the Chinese, if and when Russia is weak enough, they want it to be weaker before they make a move, but they can't afford it to become too weak in order to actually implode. So, again, I'm not a specialist on China, but I would think that at some point, and if for someone like Putin, if he hates the West so much, vassalage to China might actually seem the better option. If you can't avoid vassalage, then vassalage to China, in which people like him are protected, would seem like a better option than vassalage to the West.
Interesting. Ivan, if you could unmute, I'd be curious to hear what your point of view. We actually have someone here who's a specialist on the war in Ukraine. Ivan, if you're just to unmute, if you're there or whatnot, it'd be interesting to hear your point of view on this. Frank, do you have more to say on this?
Basically, I like that prediction of 2036. That sounds
We'll hold you
about right.
to it. We'll hold you to it.
I will hold you to right. But yeah, do you predict that China will make a sort of physical move, as in, a kinetic move, or she'll just sort of absorb, say, Taiwan? I know you're not a China expert, but based on what you've been viewing.
Well, I think at some point, I think the one lesson that I think the Chinese have learned from the Ukraine conflict is that, if you go to war against a smaller opponent whom you think is going to fold instantly, you might get an unpleasant surprise. And I don't think the Chinese want to get involved in a prolonged conflict over Taiwan. What they basically want, I think, is for the Taiwanese to essentially do what Hong Kong did, and that is, to voluntarily surrender themselves. Of course, Hong Kong, there was a specific date. But I think that that's what they're hoping, that the Taiwanese will sort of, in their view, see sense and, see the advantage of joining China. I don't think that's going to happen, but I don't think they really want to get involved in a war. But I could be wrong. But I think from China's sake that if the war is prolonged, then there's just a lot of other problems that could result. They have too many neighbors who might take advantage of this situation. If China can't deal successfully with Taiwan, maybe this is the time for, name any country along China's border to do something. And what could China do something? I think from a worst case Chinese analyst point of view, I think that there's all kinds of problems. And if you compare, like, maybe at some point it'd be easier to get some of this lost territory back from Siberia, from the treaties of 1858 and 1860 in particular. Maybe, if Russia claims eastern Ukraine, well, it's only fair that China should get back what was once belonged to it as well. But I don't see them doing more than that. And I'm not sure that they need to, do anything kinetic. In other words, at a certain point, Russia just may need financial support to such a great extent that the only one willing to give it is China. I think that someone like Putin, what he may think is that, okay, I'm at odds with the West now, but if ever China is really a threat, the West will help Russia because it will be in its interest to do so. I'm not sure, after everything that's happened, that the West would see it in its interest to help Russia against the Chinese threat. And I have a feeling that there may be, again, a lot of people who feel that in Russia that vassalage to China is superior to vassalage to the West if they can't really maintain things on their own anymore.
Interesting. Ivan, go on, Ivan. You were gonna. I'll get to you in a second, Aaron. Ivan, you just have to unmute.
I don't
Yeah, go
think
on.
No, thanks. Yeah, I was just gonna just say I have a different take on this. I don't think we have the space here for that take. So, yeah, I think that's about all I can say at like this point. But it's been a very good conversation. A lot of great perspectives and points made.
Well, now I'm curious. I want to know what you think. If you
Yeah, go on, Ivan. What the hell?
No, sorry, I'm kind of dealing with the little emergency with my daughter right now. So
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
I know what that's like. Okay.
Gotcha. Go on. Well, we'll do it another time. Go on, Aaron.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jim, for always for putting this together, and thank you, Professor Katz. I'm curious, from a grand strategy perspective, what's your perspective or what's your point of view concerning the pacing threats that each of the great powers have right now? So we've had this little conversation on Russia and China, where they stand, just using almost every kind of grand strategy theory. Isn't it, more likely that the Chinese, regardless of what they think about the Russians, being on side from a Russian perspective, is better for them right now, just because their pacing threat is the United States from their perspective, from a geostrategic perspective, and given the the strategic deterrence gap that they have, right? And this is something that I just don't think is discussed very often. Is that the United States is a strategic strike superpower, right? We maintain very few tactical nuclear weapons. The Russians are basically a tactical nuclear superpower, and they can scale up to strategic weapons when they want to, pretty quickly. But their main inventory is on the tactical side, and the Chinese are in a distant third place. So we don't really have the Cold War kind of game theory conversation anymore. And I get it. It's not in vogue in the elite circles, and because it's icky and all that stuff. But, well, if all three states, which are, from a nuclear perspective, global superpowers, maintain them and view them strategically, I think we should have those conversations. And I'm just sort of curious what your perspective is, vis-a-vis Russia, United States, and China when it comes to, the ultimate geostrategic question in grand strategy, which is the use of nuclear deterrence, and how that impacts the alliance structure or the partnership structures that obviously Russia and China can generate relative to the United States. So hopefully that question made some sense.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very important point, and I think you're right. I think that again, governments tend to be worst case analysts. And I think from the Chinese point of view, the worst case is that Russia does experience a democratic revolution, becomes allied to the West, that NATO is now on China's border, and that it's going to be China facing a tremendous threat. And so that basically, I think that China is much better off with Russia and the West at odds with each other, and would like to keep it such. In other words, I don't think that they don't want Russia to lose that war. They don't want Russia to win that war. I think they're happy with the war continuing. Personally, that keeps everyone distracted away from China, and China doesn't have to worry about Russia ever changing dramatically in its foreign policy. So I think the war in Ukraine is very useful for China, and that what they have to fear is a pro-Western Russia is
Sure.
not what they want to see at all.
One quick follow-up, which doesn't seem to get a lot of conversation, is what's your perspective on how the Russians have clearly built without a doubt, the most capable strategic alliance that North Korea seems to have had in a minimum of decades, if not quarter or half a century. And what's your, because we're not talking about the usual, like I jokingly call it, like selling junk for junk, right? Where you're just exporting a bucket of junk and then you buy a bucket of junk, and it's just it's like it's almost like academic corporate accounting. But this is something that's almost in the old days, right? From the 40s, 50s, 60s, where you're talking about tens of thousands of troops from North Korea, plus clearly enormous amounts of hardware that's coming into North Korea and back from North Korea, like legacy hardware from North Korea to the Russians and upgrading the North Koreans. What's your perspective? Because I've not found anybody like, and I'm clearly obviously at the agency and at the top echelons in intelligence strategy circles that people are having these conversations, I hope, somewhere. But China has to be giving this a certified yes to have this degree of kinetic relationship between the North Koreans and the Russians at this point, and the scale of this. Given where the proximity of North Korea is to the Chinese border, which is at the Chinese border. So what's your kind of professional opinion, or if you have any other kind of insights on this? Because I've seen like nothing. There's no books, there's no articles, like and I always tend to have a view that if I don't see anything on something like this, either like I'm so wrong, like I'm lost, or there's something going on here, but it's too sensitive that people just can't really, in open source terms, kind of, discuss it. So I'd be really, curious what you think. Once again, thank you, Professor Katz, for all your great time today.
All right, thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Well, I think we definitely need a session on North Korean grand strategy.
Yes, indeed.
That it's like
a lot of us here have a lot to say about that, but go on.
Yeah, because it's really not clear, exactly what the North Korean leader is getting out of this. He's not just sending arms, but actual troops who are dying,
Right.
and apparently, you read Ukrainian accounts, the North Koreans did very badly at first, but now they're really doing pretty well, and it's much better than one would like. Now, is North Korea getting that much in return from Russia? They apparently do have a mutual defense agreement, Russia and North Korea. I have to admit, I can't see Putin actually honoring that. Under current circumstances, if he's bogged down in Ukraine, he can't afford to be spending troops, on the Korean Peninsula. What is happening? And I just sort of wondering, certainly from South Korea's perspective, is like, are they actually not so sad? In other words, it's like tens of thousands of North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine are not fighting against South Korea. That's for sure. It's really pretty bizarre. Is Kim Jong-un exporting his troops because he's afraid of certain of his units? In other words, it's like he doesn't want them there at home to overthrow him, like in a regular, third world country. What could happen? This hasn't happened in North Korea. Is he keeping them preoccupied? Does he see this as training for a war with South Korea? If so, it's a pretty expensive lesson. It's like you're losing an awful lot of the people whom you're sending to get experience. Does Putin regard the North Koreans, or will he turn to them as a sort of Praetorian guard if he can't, if he can't rely on his own troops at a certain point? The North Koreans seem to be very loyal. Will they protect him in extremis? I don't know. It's clearly Kim Jong-un wouldn't be doing this unless he thought he was getting something much more valuable in return. But it just seems that it's it's obviously something that will not help North Korea, integrate. In other words, to reduce sanctions or anything else like this. This is a country a leadership that doesn't want to have sanctions removed on it. I mean, just why do this? Why get involved in Ukraine? Can the Russians really supply him with something so valuable, considering how, they need weapons for their own conflict? We really do need someone who can explain this to us. I can't.
Yeah, right. No, it's a really good question. But listen, Mark, we'll have to do something again. I'd love to do this with Africa in the modern sense with you, and have you go through that in detail because we could have a lot of fun with that too. But I want to thank you so much today for your thoughtful responses and your time. It was a great pleasure and stimulating as all hell. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. This was really great. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad to get to know this group, and hope we'll be in touch again.
We will indeed. Okay, have a good night. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.